Hello, my name is Catherine Kay and I am the Education Officer at Dove Cottage and the Wordsworth Museum, and I'm just going to talk briefly about Wordsworth's poem Michael. Now Michael is a poem that's very much a Grasmere poem. It's set in this valley and very much in this landscape. It's one of the first poems, in fact, that Wordsworth wrote when he and his sister Dorothy move into Dove Cottage in the winter of 1799, although this poem actually dates from nearly a year later. And it's first published in the second edition of Lyrical Ballads. When that collection is published, Wordsworth is very keen for his kind of poetry to have a kind of social and public use, if you like, and he sends the volume to one of the reforming politicians of the time, Charles James Fox, and particularly draws his attention to this poem and to a poem called The Brothers, because he says that part of the reason they were written were to show that men who do not wear fine clothes can feel deeply, which these days sounds like a rather obvious and maybe even verging on the patronising thing to say, but at the time there was a belief that people who were poor were supposed to be poor, that's what God wanted them to be, and that because they were poor they had kind of thicker skins and genuinely less feelings than those who were brought up in a more kind of what people would have thought of as a more civilised manner. And Wordsworth thinks this is unfair and untrue. The poem itself has a slightly difficult kind of gestation. He and Dorothy go together to Greenhead Gill, which is where the poem is set, which is just north of where I'm sitting, and they're looking for a sheepfold, which is the central image of the poem. And we know from Dorothy's journal that they find one in the shape of a heart unequally divided, which is lovely. But Wordsworth then struggles with the poem for weeks, and it's recorded in Dorothy's journal by him making himself ill and being unsuccessful. We know at one point he burns the poem completely and starts again. But what we're left with is a kind of beautiful blank verse poem. Quite a sad poem, I should warn you in advance. The plot of this, insofar as it exists, is there is a Grasmere shepherd called Michael, who is quite elderly when the poem begins, but has spent his entire life out in the landscape. Wordsworth thought people like the kind of local shepherds had particularly close ties with the landscape, and he resented the idea that people didn't kind of think of them as having particularly fine feelings. This is how he describes Michael's kind of connection with the land that he's grown up on, but has also belonged to his family for generations. And grossly that man errs who should suppose that the green valleys and the streams and rocks were things indifferent to the shepherd's thoughts. Fields where with cheerful spirits he had breathed the common air, hills which with vigorous step he had so often climbed, which had impressed so many incidents upon his mind of hardship, skill or courage, joy or fear, which like a book preserved the memory of the dumb animals whom he had saved, had fed or sheltered, linking to such acts the certainty of honourable gain. Those fields, those hills, what could they less, had laid strong hold on his affections, were to him a pleasurable feeling of blind love, the pleasure which there is in life itself. So there is no doubting that for Wordsworth, his thought about these people is kind of a deep connection with the landscape. From here we find out a little bit about Michael's background. He's married to a woman called Isabel, and they have one son, Luke, who's kind of a child of their old age. And the idea is that Luke will be able to continue the family tradition of being shepherds on the land, which, as I've hinted at, has been going on for generations in Michael's family. But then a tragedy, sort of, unfolds. Years earlier, Michael has been guarantor for a kind of loan for another member of the family, and that's all gone badly wrong, and there is a chance that Michael will lose the land. And this is how he describes the potential of that loss. And yet, if these fields of ours should pass into a stranger's hand, I think that I could not lie quiet in my grave. So Michael wants to preserve the land, but the only solution they can come up with is that their son should leave the family lands and go and make his fortune in London, and that will be the way of discharging the debt. Now at this point, you could diverge from Wordsworth's opinion that the land is of crucial importance and that they must keep it. And there is a bit of a toss-up when you're reading this poem, I think, as to whether you think Michael does the right thing by trying to preserve the land, or whether he does the wrong thing by kind of almost putting the value he puts on the land above the value he puts on his son, which is definitely an argument you can have. Read the poem, make your own mind up. But this is how Michael describes it to his wife. Our Luke shall leave us, Isabel. The land shall not go from us, and it shall be free. He shall possess it, free as the wind that passes over it. So the intention is that this is kind of a temporary thing for the greater good. Before Luke leaves, there is the sheepfold that needs to be built, and Michael and his son kind of part at the sheepfold, and Michael asks Luke to lay the first stone, and the image of the sheepfold, he asks Luke to keep that in his mind, for that to sustain him through his life in the city. However, cities for Wordsworth, usually bad places. And although Luke leaves and they hear good reports of him at first, eventually he falls into disrepute and bad company and behaves so shamefully, although we never find out exactly what he does, that he has to leave for a land beyond the sea. But this is not the end of the story. The effect on Michael is profound. This is how Wordsworth describes Michael after the loss of Luke. There is a comfort in the strength of love, 'twill make a thing endurable, which else would overset the brain or break the heart. I have conversed with more than one who well remembered the old man and what he was years after he had heard this heavy news. His bodily frame had been from youth to age of an unusual strength. Among the rocks he went, and still looked up to sun and cloud and listened to the wind, and as before performed all kinds of labour for his sheep and for the land his small inheritance. And to that hollow dell from time to time did he repair, to build the fold of which his flock had need. 'Tis not forgotten yet the pity which was in every heart for the old man, and 'tis believed by all that many and many a day he thither went, and never lifted up a single stone. Michael cannot find it in his heart to finish the sheepfold, and at the end of his life and after Isabel's death, the land does go from the family and the house is sold, and there is actually no record left of the family and their presence. And in a way, that's the important thing for Wordsworth. He believes that as the teller of this tale, that otherwise would be forgotten, so the tale lives on through his poetry, but also through the memory of the people who knew and cared for and were part of the community with Michael, that they told this story, and that's how Wordsworth hears it. He hears it from them. And one of Wordsworth's concerns is that we're losing those communities and that connection, and that people like Michael will cease to exist, those communities will cease to exist, and we will lose that kind of historical connection we have with the land and to some extent with each other as well.